Good morning. I'm Stephen Kenny. I'm the founder and principal of Foresight Vector, LLC, and the director of the Strategic Foresight Initiative here at MEI. Welcome to all of you to this next session of our Futures Forum. It's an exciting week for us here, this conference that's been going on over the last 2 days, and today and tomorrow is the first major event under the banner of our program. We started the Strategic Foresight Initiative last year to serve as a platform for exploring the drivers of change and the interrelationships between current and emerging future trends that are going to shape the Middle East and North Africa over the next 10 years and beyond. Futures work and foresight work sometimes is viewed as an academic pursuit or a fanciful pursuit, or both. We believe strongly that nothing is further from that than the truth. So our even more important objective with the program is to have it deliver the kind of practical value and real world impact that we know this kind of work can deliver, and help leaders both in the US and in the Middle East region make choices and think through strategies today that will help them create the futures that they want to see. I've seen the value and impact of futures and foresight work through the work that I've done in this field over the last nearly 30 years. We have 3 guests with us today who are demonstrating that every day in their work. And the purpose of this panel is to hear from them about that work and about the impact that it's having today and the impact that foresight can have in the future in the Middle East region. All 3 of them are also members of a global community that is growing through the vision and the support of the School of International Futures in London and their Next Generation Foresight Practitioners program, or NGFP. NGFP was created to accelerate the development and the impact of the next generation of innovators and leaders who are using foresight as a key element of their work. It's a network that's really unique in the world. It now numbers more than 350 people in more than 60 countries across 6 continents. And it was created to explicitly address the lack of representation of younger generation and non-Western leaders and innovators, to help make them part of the decisions and the discussions that are happening in communities around the world about creating the future that really need to benefit from their voices and their futures thinking. So I would like to introduce each of our guests, and then we can jump right into our conversation. First, joining us from Dubai is Raya Bichari. Raya is a serial education entrepreneur and award-winning educator. She is the founder and CEO of School of Humanity, which is a revolutionary online high school with a progressive model and a futures-focused, skill-based curriculum. She's also an advisory board member to several ed tech companies and a member of the Bet Future Education Council. Raya was named by the BBC as one of the 100 most influential and inspirational women in the world, and she is the 2020 main award winner of the Next Generation Foresight Practitioners Award program. Next, joining us from Beirut is Elias Mouawad. Elias is the head of exploration at the UNDP Accelerator Lab in Lebanon. He has extensive experience in innovation and in both technology and social entrepreneurship research and program development across Lebanon and the Arab region. He's led programming and partnership development for a number of organizations connecting the Lebanese tech startup ecosystem to the Arab states and the UK's. And he is the inaugural year winner this year, just a few weeks ago, as the Next Generation Foresight Practitioners Award, Special Award for the MENA region. So welcome, Elias. And finally, joining us from Oman is Motaz Al-Riyami. Motaz is the Executive Director for Gas at the Petroleum Development Oman. He previously worked at Royal Dutch Shell in The Hague as a member of the Group Strategy Business Environment Leadership Team, which is known to some as the Shell Scenario Team and is widely recognized in the strategic foresight world as a pioneer and gold standard. Motaz has worked on numerous strategic foresight projects for Oman's Vision 2040, and also as a member of the expert advisory group for the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent, supporting their Vision 2030 project. And Motaz has been a judge in the Next Generation Foresight Practitioners program. So welcome, and thank very much to all of you for joining us today. Let me jump right in and ask you each to talk with us about the work that you're doing. Elias, if I can start with you. Congratulations on being recognized as the MENA award winner for the Next Generation Foresight Practitioners. Tell us, if you will, a little bit about the project that you're working on that led to that recognition.
Hi, Stephen. Thanks for having me, and thanks for the opportunity. It's a great pleasure to be here. In a nutshell, my proposal seeks to explore the future of the social contract and fragile context, taking Lebanon as a case study. Right? This has been inspired by the numerous systemic congruent crises that the country has been going through, especially in the last 2 years, right, where compounded crises all came together and then went out of control completely. So just a bit of context quickly. In the last 2 years, Lebanon has been facing a major political deadlock, the third worst economic crisis ever recorded, a massive brain drain of youth and the most qualified workforce, high polarization, rising social tensions, and they all came together, right? Which is normal if we think about it systemically, right? One thing leads to another. However, amidst all of these challenges and problems, appeared new narratives, right? New social assemblies, new business models, right? All of these positive signals that were coming out of these challenges. And those all revolved around rethinking, in a way or another, the social contract that brings us all together, even if it's not necessarily framed as explicitly as that. So while sometimes blurry, sometimes conflicting, right, sometimes unexpected, but those signals do converge around a new vision of the country that does not necessarily always stick together. And hence, I thought, what better way to include people, right, or to explore it ourselves, try to have it as open as a process as possible to lead towards that. So in a nutshell, that's it. The project aims to experiment with participatory future approaches, right? A lot of it based on narratives, some based on speculative design, right? When it's more linked to the urban environment and how does that shape up at least part of the identity. And here I'm naming specifically Beirut after the port explosion, and when we saw all of these positive emerging signals coming out of. So this is it. The project is still being designed as we speak, but what is sure is that the intent is to make it as open as possible, as participatory as possible, and as open as possible.
That's terrific. Thank you so much. Raya, let me turn to you. When I was going to college, I was drawn to schools that had an alternative model and that were looking at futures, not futures in the sense of foresight studies, but looking at the future in some innovative ways. But what you're doing at the School of Humanity with a global student body and at the high school level is unlike anything I've ever seen. If I ask you, please tell us about the school and your vision for it and what's unique and important about what you're doing there.
Sure. And thank you, Stephen, and thank you to the MEI team for bringing us all together. So I got into the education space very much by accident. I actually did my undergraduate degree in neuroscience, but I hated my undergraduate degree so much that it kind of instilled a frustration towards the education system at large. While I was really passionate about the field, I just felt like the archaic industrial era model of lecture-based lessons with an emphasis on knowledge and memorization and paper-based exams was just not measuring my abilities. And I also felt like it wasn't helping me find meaning and purpose in life. And I saw that in my peers as well. So that's kind of the place through which I went into kind of the education space. And for a few years with my last company, a lot of the work that we did was very extracurricular, and we worked with governments, we worked with private school providers to try to fill in the gaps in the traditional school curriculum by teaching students the skills that are not covered in schools. And very quickly, I started to get frustrated. Like many other people who've tried that approach, you quickly start to realize that tinkering with the existing system has its limitations. In the words of Buckminster Fuller, sometimes what you need to do is not change existing reality, but create a new model that makes the old one obsolete. So School of Humanity kind of emerged out of that second wave of frustration, as I would describe it. And everything that we do at the school is aimed at reimagining what we learn, how we learn, why we learn, and where we learn. So in terms of what we learn, we really reimagined high school curriculum and asked ourselves, what kind of a world do we want to live in? You know, what are the competencies that young people need to have in order to create that kind of a world? We asked ourselves, what are the most in-demand kind of skills in this emerging workforce? And what are the requirements to live a life of human flourishing? You know, what are some of the competencies you need around that? And that's what our curriculum focuses on. And in terms of how the learning happens, at the schools, learners develop these competencies and mindsets and values by really designing solutions to local and global challenges. A part of that is applying foresight and adaptive foresight to that. We also wanted to change the incentives of why we learn. So instead of having learning be incentivized around exams and tests, it's incentivized by a desire to better oneself and better the world. Finally, in terms of where the learning happens, the vision for the school is an online first one. We felt like a lot of schools, unfortunately, during COVID, were forced to simply digitize an old model and move it online. Whereas we felt like in order to really make something that's social and engaging and project-based in an online setting, you had to design it from scratch for online. And so that's what we did. But we are aiming to also have a hybrid aspect to it with some pilots that we're starting in the fall. So that's a high-level overview of the vision of the school and where it comes from.
And the students in the school, are they engaged in projects that are really sort of putting those skills to work in sort of practical initiatives in their local communities? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So instead of courses, we have interdisciplinary learning paths at School of Humanity. Examples of these include future of medicine, self-knowledge and well-being, sustainable cities, sustainable fashion. And what that means is each of these paths leave room for you to develop any skill from science to, communication skills. It's a very open-ended and interdisciplinary experience. To give a few examples of some of the projects we saw in our last cohort, we had one learner, for example, design a robot that could potentially convert CO2 into oxygen on Mars with the intention of designing space settlements. So she learned a bit of chemistry, robotics, and a couple of different skills to do that. Another learner developed a policy recommendation paper that aimed at improving the mental well-being of her peers in her community in Calgary. And that actually went really far. She took it to her school and the local council, and they said they would implement it. So that was a really exciting thing that came out of it. And these are like real, they're not just kind of side extracurricular passions for them. It really are opportunities for deep learning to happen and for really advanced learning to happen, but also in a way that actually contributes to more meaning and purpose for the learner and bettering society at large.
That's terrific. That's very cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mataz, let me turn to you. I read a recent interview that you did in the Oman Economic Review where you talked about looking for and learning to read signals and drivers of change. Tell us about how you incorporate that in your work and the impact that it's having, not just in PDO, but in other kinds of organizations and communities that you work with.
First of all, thank you, Stephen, for having me, and thanks to the MEI for hosting this really important topic. It's also a pleasure for me to be sharing the platform with my fellow panelists. And I also relate to quite a lot of what you said in your introduction on the value and impact of foresight. And so when I joined the Shell scenario team, back in the day, I was privileged to be in a full-time role that does nothing but contemplate future pathways and translate insights from scenarios into strategy and business opportunities. And while that is an investment not every organization may be able to afford, The reality is we can and should make the space to read the signals around us, be they weak or strong, and understand the key drivers of change that can affect our work, like policy drivers, technology drivers, or economic drivers, to name a few. So even today, while I'm playing an asset management role, I still make sure that my team and I are making the time to consider external factors outside of our day-to-day business, outside of our day-to-day conversations that can affect us. So what are the changes that can occur? And even better, what are the changes that we can create? The signals are out there, be they weak or strong, but we need to scan the horizon and pick them up. As we're taught in the scenario planning world, the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed.
That's very true. If you could, what are some of the signals that you've been paying attention to recently that are seeming to have some of the greatest impact on your work?
So you know, obviously, for us here, we were fortunate that we were already scanning the horizon when it came to things like supply chain disruptions, potential supply chain disruptions. When COVID kicked out, when COVID was first, if you like, with us as a reality, we started very early on to understand and map how the possible pathways are going to play out, and what do we need to do as an organization to respond to that. And I'm happy to share that you know, quite a lot of the changes we enacted upon really early on in the pandemic was very powerful and allowed us to remain resilient and also to introduce you know, the changes that were required.
Excellent. I think that really shows the importance of doing this kind of work. Thank you. I'd like to, well, first, before I go on, let me say to our audience members, we welcome you submitting your questions. If you'd like to ask anything of Elias or Mutaz or Raya, you can use the Q&A feature that's at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll see those questions as they come in and make time before we wrap up today to get those questions out there. So please feel free to do that. For my next question, I'd like to ask each of you, kind of in the spirit of what I said at the opening about the sort of the practical usage of this kind of thinking and these kinds of tools, about some of the challenges or opportunities that you see in the present day, and how foresight and foresight thinking can play a role in addressing them, and how perhaps you're already seeing that. Let me start again with you, Elias, if I can. I know the work you're doing in the NGFP project, you're doing as an individual, and while you don't speak for UNDP, of course, when we talked previously, described some of the things that are being done in the Accelerator Lab in Lebanon that really bring some of this into play, a simulation in particular that you talked about. Tell us about how some of this is really playing out in the real world in the work that the Accelerator Lab is doing.
Absolutely. In general, if I can maybe, if I can say, we're trying to do work in two threads, right? The internal work as UNDP moves slowly towards integrating foresight as a core capability to change internally, but also change the service offering that we provide our partners. So we're trying to do a lot of, I can call it guerrilla foresight work, right? Integrating bits and pieces, tools, thinking, methodologies, mindsets, what have you, in different parts of the planning processes of brainstorming, right? Even sometimes MENA. So we're trying to build a coalition of the knowledgeable and the willing by showing proof internally, and that takes some time and that takes some effort. But this is in a way strategic by itself for the organization on the longer term. Now, externally, as you mentioned, Stephen, one of the most interesting case studies that we work on is an alternate reality simulation that was run in 7 cities globally. Beirut was one of them as part of a learning exercise post-COVID, right? If there's one thing we learned is that preposterous scenarios are no longer preposterous, right? And this filtering that we usually do in our minds, like, no, this is not gonna happen ever. No, that's not the reality anymore. So what the Strategic Innovation Unit at UNDP did is create this game space to try to manage city systems in uncertain events based on plausible, probable, possible, and preposterous scenarios, with the objective of trying to manage the city, but also using heuristics as a way of managing, navigating complexity. One quote was, I think, from the Dutch Prime Minister, if I'm not mistaken. He said, during COVID, we had to take 100% of the decisions for 50% of the information, right? So that set the context for our simulation. So this simulation, what it also created is a safe space for stakeholders that usually do not necessarily work together. Here we're talking third sector, local government, central government, private sector, but also individuals, right? And different representations and level of representations. So bringing them all into one room where they are sharing responsibility, all of them together, and collectively making decisions. So it first created the space for people to come together. It banked on their collective intelligence, right? It taught us a lot on what are challenges that we have integral to our systems, what are lacks that are existing in governance structures, in financing, in communication, and even in mindsets. To start with, and how far or close are we from imagining the worst happening. Although this happened in Beirut after the blast, and in people's mind, there was nothing worse that can happen. And based on the research and the scenarios we played, it's still not true, right? There's a lot of events that the city and the country is prone to that we're not necessarily thinking of. So that was uncomfortable at some point, and let's be very, very honest about it. But this is also part of it, right? How can you create these safe spaces at the same time make them uncomfortable enough for people to push their boundaries of their thinking? So that was the project, and now this is transforming bit by bit into a service offering itself. Right, because while yes, there is uncertainty or navigating uncertainty as an underlying factor there, but we're also looking at the possibilities of using this as a structured communication tool between different players or different stakeholders, different levels of authority, but also as a tool to engage people more and more, especially when it comes to scenarios and possibilities impacting their own lives and on a daily basis. So started one way, and this is still part of the learning. Again, we're still experimenting a lot with that, but hopefully this will also transform into a much broader service offering as well.
I think you're touching on something really important there, particularly there at the end about bringing people who look at an issue or a possibility in different ways and bringing them together and seeing things that we might not otherwise see in that kind of environment. I think that's really important. As you looked across the different scenarios, plausible and preposterous and all of the above, were there any particular insights that emerged looking across them in terms of a change that might be important in governance or community development or anything else?
Well, first, I mean, again, let's recontextualize this a bit, right? So this happened post-plastic. So in general, people's mindset were in response mode, right? If something happens, how can we respond to this in the fastest, cheapest, more inclusive way possible? However, what we're usually missing out on is the second layer of impact, right? And this is where we are pushing, using this tool, more systemic thinking. Yes, we're trying to solve the solution now, but how can we break away from short-termism, right? But I mean, in general, looking at some of the outcomes, one of the scenarios, for example, that we played, which is not a preposterous one, that is a Mediterranean tidal wave, right? And the impact of the Mediterranean tidal wave, at least, is that, let's imagine the Mediterranean Sea rising 5 to 10 meters. What would that mean for the country? Right? What would it mean for its infrastructure? What would it mean for its cities? As a coastal country, how are we thinking of energy security? How are we thinking of urbanization? How are we thinking of local development, right? And what have you. So unlocking those things bit by bit, issue by issue.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you. Raya, let me turn to you. You want to go back to something you said earlier, that you felt you needed to create a new model for what school is and how learning is done to make the old one obsolete. And School of Humanities certainly is an altogether different model. Of course, I think there can be, and I think you would agree, there should be, many different models. There's not just one model to replace the old one. What are some of the ways that you think educators and even people outside the education field can think about what those alternative possible models are for a future school, and also envision how to make those come into being, right? Not just make them ideas, but actually things that we see implemented.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I just wanted to quickly comment, and this connects to my answer to comment on something Elias said, which we saw in the education space as well. About 2 years ago is when I first started playing it with the idea of the new type of schooling system and a new type of school. But back then it sounded really outrageous to people and really crazy to people. So whether it was investors or whether it was government regulators and accreditors, anyone I would share it to, it would immediately, the reaction I would get is something like that would take 5 to 10 years. You can't just, it's not realistic. But post-COVID, I think people's definition of impossible really changed. And I hope that is a long-lasting change. But coming out of the pandemic and launching this, it didn't sound so crazy anymore. So just some similarity I noticed between the two spaces that we're in. So how can we design, imagine a new model? I think a lot of the biggest challenge I see with reinventing education is a challenge of imagination. We have all gone through a really similar system, regardless of where in the world we went to high school or university, right? If you think about the commonalities that we were sitting in classrooms, we had grades where students were organized by age. We had exams, we had timetables, we had periods with lessons. There were 5 days of school and a weekend. Like, it sounds like I'm describing the obvious, but these are assumptions. We assume schools are going to be like that, right? And one of the things we did is just mental exercise of erasing all of that in our minds and saying, if we didn't have any of those assumptions, if we had to start from scratch with the needs of today's world in mind, what would that look like? Would we still go to school 5 days a week? Would we still organize learners by age? Would we still have subjects even? And that exercise was really powerful. I think it's also referred to as first principles thinking. There's another tool you can label it with, is the adjacent possible. So exploring, the adjacent to what is currently happening. And we did that at a curriculum level, at a model level, and it's something we regularly try to inspire our learners to do. So that really simple yet super challenging exercise, I think, is key in trying to imagine a new model. And to answer the second part of your question around how do you implement it, I think one of the first things we realized very quickly is you have to take a systems thinking approach to implementation, because you cannot just design a model like this for students without dealing with university admissions and without dealing with government regulations for accrediting a school, without dealing with the parents, without dealing with industry and the industry workforce, right? So there's all these pieces to society and the systems of our world that have to be taken into consideration when you're actually designing and launching a school like this. So yeah, that's what I would share on that front.
Well, that's terrific. And again, I think you're touching on something really important there. It's the idea of taking current assumptions, which may not be valid in the future, and in some cases may not even still be valid today, and just wiping them clean is an important approach. And then to your latter point, thinking about all the other stakeholders who, even if you've wiped away those assumptions in your exercise, they still hold them. So how do we now engage them and not put them through the same thought process, but just confront them with some new ideas that challenge things that they've held, in some cases, very strongly for a long time.
Exactly. And there's places where we constantly have to find this balance of what are things we're not willing to compromise on, and what are things where maybe we have to play the game a little bit while the other systems of the world kind of transition and adapt. And I think anyone in our position would have to do that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Mutaz, what are some of the challenges or opportunities that PDO is facing as you're charting the future course of the organization? Or I know you've participated in some work on the future of the country of Oman. So maybe at that level, some challenges or opportunities, at that level, and how you think foresight thinking can help address some of them or seize some of those opportunities.
So thanks, Stephen, for the question. I think whether it's the region or whether it's the country, I mean, the region that's associated with very closely with energy, and so the energy transition is front and center of quite a lot of the thinking and the strategy, and for us in PDO, like every other oil and gas company, we're looking to understand how we can play our part in the energy transition, whether that is decarbonizing our own footprint, or whether that is us looking to produce or export new forms of clean energy. I enjoyed listening yesterday to the panel on the future of energy, which touched on the different aspects of the transition. And we certainly subscribe to a lot of what was said. The energy transition thus far has been very volatile, and that is clearly evident in the recent highs and lows that we've been seeing in terms of energy prices. Now that volatility is where you extract, back to your point at the very start, that volatility is where you extract the most impact and the most value of foresight. Typically, most organizations chart their course based on a single outlook, where in reality you're dealing with an uncertainty envelope. That is where scenarios and foresight help you bookend the possible outcomes and plan for the potential change and potential disruptions. If you're in commercial real estate today, you're probably thinking, how is this working from home thing going to play out? The reality is working from home has been with us for a while. It's been with us. It's been with us for a very long time, many years. And COVID was merely both a disruptor and an accelerator of change. When you think of a system, when you think of it from a systems perspective, so a recent example here in PDO is we commissioned a scenario study on the future of work for our HR department to understand what are the potential changes that are coming our way as a result of the energy transition. What specifically are the changes we may need to consider for our HR policies? And some really interesting insights came out of it. What does employment look like in 10 years' time? As we think about upskilling, and you just reflect on alternative education models that Rhea just mentioned, and in the context of the fourth industrial revolution, are you really looking at the traditional models and cycles of upskilling, or are we looking at a future and a world where actually there will be multiple cycles of individuals upskilling and updating their qualifications? So really, foresight is about making your organization more resilient. It's about making your organization future ready.
Excellent, thank you. Well, to kind of bring us to a close, let me ask a question to all of you, and I guess in a way, in the spirit of futures thinking, if I could fast forward you 5 or 10 years into the future, what do you think could be one of the most powerful positive impacts in the region if we're wildly successful in growing the number of people who think this way, who use these kinds of methods and challenge assumptions and walk toward the uncertainty rather than away from it? We talked, all of us, earlier in the week in preparation for this panel today about the importance of education and educating people and how to think differently. So if we're wildly successful in that, what would some of the biggest positive impacts of that be? Let me ask each of you. Ryan, let me maybe start with you on that.
Sure. I think specifically with the region, one of the things I'm always in awe of living in Dubai is the sheer multiculturalism of it. And not in the traditional Western sense. I've lived in the West as well. And often what happens in a lot of countries there is you kind of lose your culture as you move there. And one of the beauties of the United Arab Emirates right now, at least, is how the togetherness that I see constantly accelerating. And this is connected to the fact that right now we have Expo 2020 happening, and the theme is all around connecting minds and creating the future. And so there's something to be said about in a world where it feels like we're so divided, about Middle East in general, being able to potentially bring people together in a cohesive way that would allow us to create the future together as a society. Because I think a lot of the problems that we're seeing in today's world, as we've all established, aren't going to be tackled by one region or by one nation state. It needs a global approach and a systems approach. But the first step to doing that effectively is to kind of have that unity across our humanity. So that's where I see the next 5 to 10 years being successful in the region.
So, Matthias, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, if we look at the composition of the demographic pyramid in the region, it has a very wide base, and the youth constitute the largest part of society. And so, in the context of changes that may be coming our way, be they energy transition, be it the future of work, or the future of immigration, or the future of cities, how can we use scenario planning or foresight as not only a planning tool, but also a tool for intergenerational dialogue and intergenerational fairness? How do we engage our youth in a way that is not only inspirational, but also gives them agency when it comes to shaping their own future? And I also would like to call out the School of International Futures on the work they're doing on intergenerational fairness and in that space, and everything they're doing to bring that into the mainstream. So I think if we are able to successfully deploy foresight and make it more mainstream in the region, then certainly with models like Reyes, in terms of bringing system thinking into school at such an early stage, and then bringing it into government as a tool to connect as well with the youth. I think that's quite it's quite a powerful opportunity that we have.
I couldn't agree with you more. Absolutely. Elias, let me ask you the same question. If we're in the future at some point, and more people are thinking this way and doing this kind of work, what do you think some of the positive outcomes could be?
If I have to think of one thing that I would like to see, from replicating this on an individual level, or even seeing more and more institutions doing that more broadly, it would be to collaboratively envision inclusive and citizen-centric systems, right? And for me, that is a basis. That is a basis that can be shaped up or shaped by education, energy transition, right? That really looks at the role of youth in the future. I mean, I completely agree with Mu'taz. One major element that we need to be looking into today is the demographic component of the region, and how might that change, but also the responsibility that these today teenagers are longing to play, right, and to take on and show on the world. I think this is, in a way, if I had to draw a picture of success, that would be it.
Excellent. It's striking to me how all three of you touched on something very similar to each other, and how much that draws on. I've been at all of the panels over the last several days of our Futures Forum, and this idea of inclusivity has come up in important ways in all of them. And in very, very different topic areas. We've talked about the future of finance and money on the first day, and talked about the unbanked and how do we create a more inclusive financial system. We spent yesterday talking about energy and climate change, this morning talking about the future of cities in the panel before this one, and this idea of bringing communities together and crossing boundaries that needn't be boundaries, whether it's generational boundaries or sociocultural boundaries. It's come through in all the conversations we've had this week, and obviously come through very strongly in this conversation as well. I think that says a lot. Well, great. We're just about at time, so I want to first of all thank all of you very much, Eli and Raya and Mu'taz, for making the time to join us today and share with us some of the things that are going on in your work, and some of the impacts that it's having. And as you did, Mu'taz, I want to do a hat tip to Kat Tully, the Managing Director of the School of International Futures, for their leadership of the Next Generation Foresight Practitioners program, and all the rest of the fantastic work that they're doing there. It's a pleasure working with them, and it's a pleasure working with the three of you. And I look forward to continuing the dialogue with you all in the future. So thank you all very much, and we'll see you again.